All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will trickle in, but this is a nice intimate group to start with, and I know we have some people on Zoom as well. But thank you for coming to this speaker series with Daphna. As all other meetings, this meeting will be recorded, and I'll send it out afterward as well. And we'll also be able to send the deck out to everyone. So I know that always gets asked. We'll be sending it out. So to introduce Daphna, behind me here. So Daphna is a performance psychology consultant working with elite athletes and teams, which has included the New York Mets. Her diverse profile and style reflect a strong interdisciplinary understanding across performance psychology and human analytics. Daphna's background includes competing for the University of Pennsylvania's D1 varsity track and field team while studying at Wharton and the School of Engineering. Since then, her experience includes development and rollout of Deutsche Bank's workforce analytics team, becoming the bank's first HR profit center. After earning her master's in sports psychology, she founded her own mental skills and performance analytics consulting practice, which is called Be Sports Minded, LLC. Combining people analytics with sports science and psychology, she developed a methodology called Future Advantage Scouting Talent, which enhances scouting practices and proactively identifies necessary mental resources for player development. She has automated the process to include a comprehensive look at player performance and personality, which can be mapped to organizational culture. She has recently spoken at an executive HR roundtable and an HR hacking event, and has graciously volunteered her time to speak to our Targeted Mentor program today. So with that, please help me in welcoming Daphna Aronson.
Thank you. I'm going to sit. I don't feel like just keep it nice and cozy. Thank you. I appreciate being here, and actually I love what I do, and so being able to sort of connect it back with the world, the corporate world, is something that I enjoy doing, bringing psychology and people analytics together. But so a little bit more just I'd say one way to think about what I do now for sports teams, yes, there's the typical mental skill side where I work with not only the athletes, but the coaches themselves on how to improve certain character traits so that they can handle adversity, how do they handle pressure, overcome anxiety, not just wait till a problem comes, but really sort of be proactive. But what I really love now is this machine learning platform that takes the front of someone's trading card and who they are and matches it to the back, the data statistics, which is really what, when we think about analytics in sports, we're used to hearing about just the back of the card. And so I bring in the front, and we have a more comprehensive understanding of who this person is, not just from an athlete's perspective, and we match it to the culture and the environment, so we can understand if, when, and how they will be successful in the environment we're asking them to perform in. So to bring that into what we're doing today, I've got 4 things that I'd like to cover with you. It's a little bit more on the theory side. Lindsay said you guys don't mind really getting into it. I love it. I think it's fascinating stuff. If it's ever like too complex or we need to slow things down, just interrupt and ask me a question. I definitely encourage like some back and forth, whether it's using an example from something that's happening in work or something that's just happening in your life, so that we can talk about it and see if it's really being applied, you're applying it the right way. Let's do that, just so it really all makes sense. So 4 things we want to try to do today is discuss self-efficacy and motivation theory. So the concept for what we're doing today is, how do you bring self-efficacy in the workplace? Then we're going to look at introducing character identification, and Lindsay sent out the link to a character survey. That was just one fun way of sort of trying to build your self-awareness and understanding. We're going to go through some of that and give you an opportunity to do something similar to identify those traits if you haven't taken the assessment. Then we're going to connect the two. So you understand a little bit about yourself, and now you understand more about motivation and self-efficacy. So how do we bring them together? And then finally, how do we use that intelligently in the workplace? So to get started, who would like to take a stab at describing the difference between self-confidence and self-efficacy. Anyone have a sense of what the differences are? Or does someone even just want to start with self-confidence, which maybe is a little bit more of a common term?
I guess from a self-confidence perspective, how capable you feel in a given role or environment and how that translates to the environment around you, to the people that you interact with, and then maybe self-efficacy is how aware of what you do and how that impacts other people.
Self-confidence definitely is a little bit more of the broad term of how you feel about your role in a task or in an environment. Anyone else? Self-efficacy? Anyone on Zoom? So when we're talking about self-efficacy, we're talking about how you feel you can execute a very specific task. So it's one thing to say, I'm a great baseball player. It's another thing to say, I think I could be an excellent pitcher. So in the corporate world, right, we say, I think I'm a fantastic employee versus I think I'd be an awesome salesperson. And so self-efficacy is specifically concerning your judgment and how you're going to execute the skill. And it works more when you've actually acquired the skill than when it's inherent. So some of us are naturally stronger in certain areas, but when you've actually worked to acquire that skill set, your self-efficacy grows. So that's important when we think about how we develop ourselves as not only employees, but the people who are working with us, and also in teams when we're thinking about player development. How do we make people feel like they are graduating to the next level without just making it outcome oriented? So that being said, anyone questions? Does that make sense? There's a clear distinction. So motivation is a big component of self-efficacy. So I thought we would start there and talk about the theory of motivation. I've deliberately blacked out part of this chart. We'll reveal it later on, but I just wanted to focus first on this concept. So motivation has two parts, intrinsic and extrinsic. I see a couple of heads nodding. What do we think of when we think of intrinsic motivation?
How passionate you are to do something, so coming from like within.
Exactly. When you're doing something because it resonates with a value, because it's internally bringing joy and passion. It's not related to an outcome, and it's derived by things that you are in control of. Contrarily, the extrinsic is really focusing on what's your reward? What is the outcome going to give me that I value? And so it's not about one's bad and one's good and we shouldn't have extrinsic. It's out there in our world, right? Whether it's trying to be promoted, get to the major leagues, whether it's saying, I want someone to just give me that positive feedback. It can come in a lot of different ways of acknowledgement and rewards. At the end of the day, it's okay to have that. However, the actual effort and the continuation of the effort is going to come with a heavier emphasis on intrinsic. So sort of like when you enter the honeymoon phase of whether it's your job or something new that you've started, everything around you seems super exciting. But after a while, if that starts to fade, all those extrinsic things sort of go away. If you're not still feeling it in your gut, if something's not resonating with you inside to actually work through things, to be creative, to sort of get your juices flowing, it's time to check in and understand why. So when we're talking about motivation and performance motivation, there's three different types: goal setting, expectancy, and self-efficacy. So goal setting is sort of like your standard basic. I look for it with teams when I assess different athletes I try to understand where they are in these, like which one do they sort of lean towards. And a goal setting someone who's got a lot of goal setting is someone whose behavior is regulated by the goal. Okay, they are task oriented, they need that goal in front of them, and they go like a worker bee until they achieve it. So a lot of leaders have goal setting motivation out there where they're putting these SMART goals together, that they're specific, they're measurable, they're adjustable, realistic, and they're time oriented. Okay, so someone can have goal setting motivation. Expectancy motivation. Okay, so that is takes goal setting motivation to another dimension, and that adds what you feel about the outcome. So it's sort of saying, first of all, I like this goal, but I value what I'm going to get out of it, whether it's recognition, reward, whatever that is. I also believe that if I do the job, I'm going to receive that reward. And finally, it's saying that I have the resources here to actually take care of it. So athletes that have been big fish in a small pond come and get drafted, and they take a look around them, and if they don't feel like they have what it takes to get to the next level, they don't expect to actually keep growing. And part of that you can connect back to intrinsic, and it gets into other areas. But the difference is now you're just adding your own value constructs onto how you're executing these goals. And finally, what we're looking at is self-efficacy motivation. So self-efficacy motivation is you are focused on a single task. So in my world, it's looking at people who have one role. So you're looking at a pitcher, you're looking at a placement kicker, a goalie, and you're understanding where their focus is at, as opposed to it being so broad at being great at all these things. Their motivation is to be great at really one thing. Make sense? Cool. All right, so now let's dive into self-efficacy. So we talked about motivation, and we talked about intrinsic and extrinsic. And intrinsic motivation is a huge component of deriving one's self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is made up of 3 components, and you can use the acronym CAR to help remember each component. It's competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So intrinsic motivation is what drives our competence and our autonomy, and those two actually have their own research-based research that led to the theory up there you see is cognitive evaluation theory. So how does this all come together? And that's reflected in this triangle. So if you are an agent, right? The competence says, I believe I can do what it takes. So agent to means, that's your competence area. Agent to ends is your outcome, says, I actually feel like I have a part in the cause of the outcome. So if you're on a team and your team wins, do you feel like you actually contributed to that win? So if you're at work, do you feel like your work has meaning? Do you feel like it actually makes a dent in the overall company's growth and innovation? And this last angle, this actually goes more to that expectancy side. This contingency belief is, do I have the strategy? Do I have the right things around me that are going to allow me to bring my competency and my autonomy together? So when we're talking about cognitive evaluation theory, and competence and autonomy must come together. It's great to have one, but without the autonomy, without that control, you're not going to get to that outcome. Does that make sense? So when you think about in your own world, whether it's at work, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's just on a weekend, how you find ways to build your competency belief and your control belief. Basically saying, what do I believe I can do? And where am I actually executing something that's going to have an effect? So when we think about that in terms of ourselves, we're sort of saying, like, where's our purpose and value, right? Where are we effectuating that? And so these belief systems start to replicate patterns in our head that start when we're really young. It goes back to attachment theory, it goes back to our relationships growing up, which gets into the third section, relatedness. So if you think back to your parents, your siblings, friends, family, social networks growing up, and the feedback that you were giving yourself and the feedback that you're receiving, how did that help influence how well you believe you can do something now? How much does that create a mapping to where you feel like what you do matters and has a cause and effect? And once you start to sort of build that self-awareness, you maybe become a little bit less judgmental, and you find ways and find environments where it actually encourages those things to expand and grow. Relatedness is that last part, is that last component. And what we're talking about there is culture, environment, our relationships with others. How well are we tapping into the human nature of just being altruistic and finding ways that our values are resonating with the values of the people around us. So why are sports so fun when we're young? Well, it's not because we really have the skills to be awesome when we're 9, 10, 11, 12. It's because we're with our friends and we feel like we're part of something, and it makes us feel like we have meaning. And that's the relatedness component of self-efficacy. So that's that in a nutshell. Anyone have any questions or comments there? Okay, so how do we bridge the two together? Now, this is a lot of words vomited onto this page. So let's look at, this is basically stuff we just talked about, looking at it from the y-axis and the x-axis right there.
Just they can hear you well.
Yeah. Okay, so when you think about what we talked about with competence and autonomy, think about also what the affect is in terms of effort and how determined you are, right? And there's a lot of different things that influence that, but on a basic level, on a fundamental level, it speaks to this continuum of someone who's not self-determined all the way to the self-determined side. So basically, this continuum is the structure of linking how well your effort and where your motivations come from and where your self-efficacy lies to the strongest expression of that. So going from left to right, we've got your behavior. So this is really how it's expressing itself. The motivation is really what we just talked about. Regulatory styles, you can see as a subset, but we don't need to dive into that. But the motivation, we talked about extrinsic and intrinsic, but if you have a none, if you've given up, if you know, hey, my boss is not listening, my project's not a priority, I have zero budget, I'm going to look for a new job, whatever it is. If there's something outside of work impacting your motivation, some negative relationship stuff, something happening where you're just not motivated at all, there's a motivation, right? We talked about extrinsic, and the biggest component is intrinsic. And like I said before, it's fine to have both. You probably should have both. But you really need to find out where this is in you and make that the driver. So when I was speaking about the competence autonomy, that agent ends, right, where you're executing is actually going to have a cause and impact. We're talking about a perceived locus of causality is what they talk about in psychology. So this is where you're going from something that is completely unrelated to you, like you can't even touch it externally, to it's 100% coming from within you. And when we're in a work environment and we're working with teams, sometimes we're not doing like the main work, but that doesn't mean we're not contributing in some fashion. So it's important to understand that connection of, I don't necessarily have to be doing the main thing, whether it's presenting, whether it's putting together the PowerPoint, but at some level, where am I contributing? Where am I having an impact? And maybe it's in a support role for one thing, right? Maybe it's being able to be a good listener and provide the feedback. And then this last piece is also something we don't really need to get too much into, but I wanted to give you the whole thing so when you have this at home, you can actually spend a little bit of time building your self-awareness again. This is really when we're talking about the regulatory processes. You're talking about, do I feel like that this is something that is caused by luck? Or is this because I sought it out, I have satisfaction from doing it, and as a result, it's going to be good? So it's sort of like in basketball, right? Do they make the shot? Was it a luck shot, or was it because of all of the effort and skills and practice and repetitions and recovering from failure that led to making that shot? So that is where self-efficacy and motivation sort of cross the line into your behavior and how it affects and that circle, that repetition of there's a stimuli, here's my belief system. If I believe, if I'm on this side, I believe I have competence and autonomy, then I'm going to go forward with the outcome. And whatever the result is, good or bad, I'm going to recognize that feedback as a way for me to grow and actually get better. Because you still feel like you have that control. Sometimes if you're really stuck in here and that reward feedback is not great, then you're going to start to drift a little bit further away unless you find a way to say, okay, well, wait, what is it about this that didn't work? So it's a little bit of a push-pull, and it sort of goes back to what type of person are you, right? And that's sort of what we're going to get into a little bit later. So anyone sort of have an example or want to share a story about where they feel like this idea of being self-determined, doing something out of pure interest and enjoyment led to being able to execute on something, learn a skill, be part of something? Like, where does that stand in your life right now? How does that apply to the jobs that you're doing?
I would say, I guess, on the self-determined level, I think one of the things Groupon provides a lot of different, like if you want to get your hands involved in different things, like a lot of times there is that opportunity. And so a lot of times you kind of become a point person on different projects based on things that have interested you in the past. Maybe not necessarily you get a ton of enjoyment from them, but at least something that because it's piqued your interest in the past, like you have opportunity to pursue that. And Groupon, I think, is pretty good about that of, hey, you like this, like go forth and run with it. Not necessarily that it comes to fruition, but you at least have that opportunity.
I think the other bit on that is often that also comes from you having experienced this thing on numerous occasions, so you've built up a knowledge base, right? That says, like, I've earned this, I've put in the work, I've gone through it, and now I have a good understanding of it, and then can contribute that to finding that solution. Which it seems fits.
Do you find by having access to different opportunities, it makes you better in one specific role because you're getting a nice range of perspective and learning, that it's building your self-efficacy to actually do better in an eventual role?
I think it helps identify what, from a skill set perspective, you're better suited for than things that maybe you've tried to do it and maybe it was like, okay, but you do something else better, because we've had different experiences in a lot of different types of products or projects that you're able to kind of hone in on what your true interests are and where you can draw satisfaction from.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I guess yes, in a little bit, but it just helps you understand more, what do you like, what do you not like.
Absolutely.
Like
Plus, you get to know more people, so you know who to go to quicker, right?
Yeah.
To get answers and help and assistance, whatever.
So the New England Patriots, they have a system where everyone who comes in learns their role and one other role. And by doing that, and you can draw a lot of different parallels, and there's a lot of different ways to draw some excellent conclusions from being given multiple opportunities. But one of them is the idea of how do you build trust and the resource base of knowing that I know this, but I'm also trusting that that person knows it as well. So if you need to step out, you know there's someone else who can step in for you, right? There's also the idea of I don't feel the pressure if I fail, right? I'm being encouraged to learn and go outside of my comfort zone and build my range of not only my knowledge base, but also the way in which I can apply that knowledge. And can I be creative and taking knowledge from part A and applying it some way so differently to a solution in area B. So there's a lot of really great ways that actually explores how you can, the different dimensions of self-efficacy versus just being the basketball player who's just constantly shooting free throws, right? It's that idea of you don't need to be specialized to build self-efficacy. Make sense? All right. All right, so we took care of step one. All right, so next thing what we're going to do is start to tap into who you are. Like, how do you understand yourself? How can we relate that to the people around us? And we have a couple we're like 2-part activity to demonstrate that. I'm going to take a second to just set that up.
This slide will be on the presentation for the people on Zoom to look at, right?
Yes.
Can you join the front table? Or was there room left? Yeah,
On the front?
just so that you can.
So for the people on Zoom, where would be a good place to put this? Like, should I bring my chair out?
I think as long as,
Maybe I'll hold it.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right, when we need it, I'll put it up. Almost there. Okay. Okay, so what was handed out was this slide, this character identification. And that was the link that Lindsay sent out to you, which is from the University of Pennsylvania Masters of Positive Psychology. So I'm getting my specialization in it, and there's a lot of ways to look at how do you identify personality traits, right? My platform is machine learning, so it takes out all the bias and actually the need for the assessments, but there's ways that we can start to understand a little bit about ourselves without necessarily making any judgments or determinations on it. So in positive psychology, there are 6 virtues with 24 character traits. So that's what we're looking at here. And if you took that assessment, it's 240 questions. It probably takes about 15, 20 minutes. But at the end of the day, it highlights for you where you fall. Like, it puts in order your top 5, and it sort of gives you a little bit of description. So, for example, for me, my top 5 are hope, creativity, humility, persistence, and kindness. And what I'd like to try to recreate for you guys, because we're not going to take the assessment live, is another way in which to think about it or to understand what might be your character traits. And that's through using imagery and visualization. So a lot of times with athletes, we ask them to think about their highlight reel and their best performance. Lots of reasons why we do that, but that's the technique we're going to use today. And essentially, I would love for you to take a moment to think about a time where you killed it. It could be work-related, it could be beach volleyball, it could be cooking, it could be something in your life outside of work. It could be something from this morning. But a time where you felt like at the end of it, you were really proud of yourself. And it just felt like it was natural. It didn't take stress. It didn't take a ton of work to kind of come to that level of behavior. It just happened. And you were like, hell yeah, that was me. And I'm proud of myself for doing it. And when you have that vignette in your head, I want you to think about what character traits resonated in order to make that happen. And if you take a look at the sheet, or if you're on Zoom and if you can see the slide, circle or write down the 5 or 6 character traits that you thought really made that happen. So that identify you in your best moment. Okay, part 2 involves the Coke can that's on the table, and I'm going to hold it up for our friends on Zoom. So I want you to describe the Coca-Cola can. Words, phrase, however naturally comes to you. No right or wrong, just on your own. You can write it on the back of or underneath the character traits.
Sorry, we say it one more time.
Sure. So the Coke can that's on the table, and I'm just holding it up for the Zoom colleagues, just describe it. Like, what comes to mind when you see it? You can, however is natural for you to describe something, words, phrases. There's no right or wrong. Okay. So now it's a little interactive. I'm going to use the board and just write, if someone doesn't mind sharing, what did they write for the description? So on the Coke can, maybe someone from Zoom, do you want to share what you wrote how did you describe the Coke can?
Carbonated sugar.
Okay. Oh, hold on. 1 second. Let me get the button that works. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else on Zoom want to share how they describe the Coke can?
I wrote a red round tin can with words and images in white.
Okay. Okay. So to our first colleague that described Coke can as carbonated sugar, would you please share a few, maybe the top 3 character traits that you circled for yourself?
Yeah, it's fairness, equity, and justice, leadership, and then forgiveness and mercy.
What was the last one, please?
Forgiveness and mercy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and to our second contributor from Zoom, red round tin can, words and images in white. What were a few of your character traits, please?
That was Jane.
Was that Jane?
Yeah, Jane. She's on mute.
I lost.
Oh.
That's me.
What were some of your character traits?
Oh, sorry, I didn't finish it. I actually have it open, but I didn't finish it yet.
No worries. Okay, not a problem. And then I want to take a couple people that are sitting in the room with us. Anyone want to share what was on their list?
Yeah, I just had happiness, friendship, joy, and fun. I always think about those, the big white, the polar bear, drinking some Coke, and some kids having fun or something.
I put polar bears as well.
Yeah, right?
And a couple character traits.
A couple character traits, open-mindedness, persistent, social intelligence, appreciation of beauty and excellence.
I bet you had creative.
Okay, one from this table.
Go ahead.
I did tasty,
Mhm.
sugary, Santa, diet, in Atlanta. But it made me want a diet.
Say it.
Atlanta, yes, Atlanta, the city.
Okay, And could you please share a couple of your character traits?
Love of learning, perspective, gratitude, humor. And then love. Who doesn't love love?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being comfortable enough to share. So I want the people on Zoom to be able to see it, so I'll put it in front of me where I'm going now. Okay, so what do we see here? This is an opportunity to understand a little bit about who you are. There's no, like I said before, there's no right or wrong. I'm not going to sit here and start to psychoanalyze if this connects to this anyway. That's not the point. We could, that'd be fun, but it's not what's happening here. The interesting thing, and I mean, this is probably one of my favorite sharing results, because look how awesomely different these are. I mean, we're staring at the same thing, we're looking at the same thing, and yet we're describing it in different ways. So when you're working on a team, when you're working with others, when you're talking about strengths and weaknesses and who you are, right? You might think you're communicating one thing, but the message might be received in another way. So when we're talking about how self-efficacy manifests, whether we're trying to build it in ourselves, build it in others, have it built in us, the first step is appreciating that we're all different. We're all going to do things a little bit differently. And even if on the chance like we all had written down the same thing, the difference is we're probably still all made up of different character traits. So the twofold thing here is, one, being able to appreciate your differences and the way in which it resonates with who you are, and understanding a little bit more about yourself in that way. So the next time you speak with someone, or the next time you're communicating with someone, or the next time you're trying to even just say what you mean, right? It's taking into account that there's different ways that it's going to be perceived. So if someone's trying to give you positive feedback, or you're trying to give it out, how is that really resonating with them? So it's just one thing. The second thing is when we're looking at the character traits and when you're building your own self-awareness about yourself. Granted, again, this is just like a rough sketch of who we think we are, and we're evolving, but at the end of the day, our personalities since the age of 12 are pretty stable, and it's pretty much an anchor. And you can sort of expand it and grow, but the beautiful thing is it's pretty measurable, pretty steady. So if you do the assessment, if you don't, if this is what you feel like you are, great. But understanding how that actually now manifests itself as you connect with others. So someone who has the idea of fairness and equity may not see eye to eye with someone who, it's not that they don't appreciate it, but they're not filtering it that way. So as you go through the opportunities in the culture where that promotes trying new things and growing in new ways, it's understanding what resonates with you. Well, why doesn't it resonate with me? Why doesn't this resonate with my friend that we got along on the other stuff on? So this activity was really meant to identify not only things about yourself to build your self-awareness, to continue the appreciation of how you can get stronger and in which ways you can start to get stronger, but also about the people around us and the people in our environment. And so, I'll put this down. So for example, if you're trying to engage employees, if you're trying to engage stakeholders, if you're looking to develop trust, if you're trying to just build other relationships, right? This is one way in which you can help communicate and also foster those relationships in a way where everyone's still growing and feeling motivated and staying on that side of the continuum of keeping it intrinsic, like, hey, they have a role, they have that locus of causality. Any questions? Any comments? Cool. Okay. We're done with this one. All right, so part 3, how do we put this all together? Well, one of the cool things about understanding a little bit about yourself, or just taking the time to even ask, like, what sort of character traits do I think I possess, or what really describes me, is looking at it in the context of personality. And so the machine learning platform I have actually is derived off of the IBM Watson and natural language processing for the 5-factor model. So you've got another acronym, OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The 5-factor model is pretty much the standard that's used in personality assessments. Using machine learning, it just takes the bias out of someone like me reading it, and then someone else looking at it and us coming up with different scores. But okay, so we've got these personalities. So character traits will all filter up, right? There's a lot of overlap when we talk about character traits, but they will all filter up into a personality type. How did we get that way, and how do we use it intelligently? We need to understand context, okay? We need to understand where that trait evolved from, where do we see it manifesting, and where can we nurture and grow it? So that's sort of the thing I do with the scouts and player development. It's like, yeah, this guy is great, but is he going to be great here? So it's understanding the context by which a skill was honed, and understanding how can we continue to get that execution here. Are we going to get it? Are we going to see it? How do we assimilate them to this environment? So as it relates to what we're doing here today and what you guys do for work, it's looking at how do you take advantage of the culture that you're in the work environment, and use it to build your strengths and finding those opportunities. So perhaps growth in the employment section is not just about the external pay raise, corporate title. It's finding, how do I become my better self so that I really love what I do, whether it's a rainy day, I'm in a crappy mood, I'm having a baby, and I don't know what, there's a lot of uncertainty, but knowing that the environment is actually nurturing your best self, or the version that you're looking for. So when you're thinking also about stakeholders, when you're thinking about teammates, when you're thinking about how are you connecting and engaging with customers, it's also understanding that this is happening for them too. So how can you find ways to connect with them, right? What are those anecdotes and stories that, if they're telling you something, what is it telling you it's true of? Not is it false or true, but what are you hearing from that now you can actually connect with, so that you can close whatever deal it is that you're looking to close. So we're going to go back to the performance motivation for a second. And let's see, should just come up. Ta-da. So really what we're looking at now is how the 5-factor traits can deliver insights into how strong a person can be expected to be in any of these 3 dimensions of motivation. So in a way, if you understand a little bit about yourself, you're starting to think about, how am I motivated? So there's some data points. What are those signals telling you about you? And then how do you make it work for you in the environment you're in? And that's what this is sort of mapping out, like I would take, and then I would help answer that question. But the idea is for you and in your world, how do you take who you are, how you're motivated, and bring it together so that you can execute your job the best, but it also feels good in doing it. So that gets into the why, right? At the end of the day, we are all climbing Maslow's hierarchy to find our self-actualization moment. And companies are really starting to understand that employees want that inside the workplace. They're not just seeking it outside of work. And this goes full circle back to when we first started talking about self-determination theory and that idea of what's intrinsic to oneself. And when you can start to build your workplace into a place where you are feeling like you're being self-actualized internally, not because you're getting recognition, not because people love you, not because you feel like, you're on your way to the next level. Yes, those things are great. But a lot of those things have variables to them that you have no control over. And maybe the outcome will result in that, but if that's what the focus is, that's that extrinsic dangerous side of it. So by focusing on what you can control, who you are, how you're motivated, and putting that into understanding what is your passion, what's your process, then you can endure the how. How am I going to get there? How am I going to overcome some of these barriers that I have no control over, but it's worth it because I'm really passionate about it, and it lights that fire inside of me. So that's what this slide is really talking about, is for you sitting in your own chair in this moment, how are you going to walk out and say, all right, I want to build this. I want to build my self-efficacy. I understand it's important. What are those tools, those contingency beliefs that this, from that triangle, that Groupon can offer me? And then how do I bring in my own competence and autonomy to actually create that triangle that shines bright? And just ironically, I just thought of this now, this is a triangle too, and then you'd be at the peak and it all comes together. So, any thoughts on that? Any questions? Anyone want to call BS on something? No? All right, totally open to it. It's good philosophy discussion, but I'm just trying to get you guys thinking a little bit more, not only of yourselves, but how it could work in the context of who you work with as well. All right, we're just zooming through this. Last one. So how do we do this intelligently, right? So there's a line that I like where people talk, where there's a conversation, and the conversation is about strengths and weaknesses. And it's a conversation between two people. The reason why I'm not naming them is because I can only remember one of them. And it's the second person that said what I liked. So fantastic. A little bit about me. But the comment was, there's no such thing as strengths and weaknesses. It's just, are your strengths being used intelligently or not? And I thought that was like, oh, that's interesting. It's very positive. It's very optimistic. But in the grand scheme of things, I guess that sort of makes sense, right? And I guess if we all think back to the laughable part of an interview where you say, my strengths are my weaknesses, it sort of comes to fruition there. But the idea is, okay, so we have all this great information and we're starting to make sense of it. Some things are clicking and we see ways in our lives we can start to apply it. But man, it's really hard to do that in the workplace. So how do we do it in a place where maybe we don't feel like we have so much control? And there are a lot of things that really are out of our control. So athletes, we always drill in control of the controllables. And that's nice to think about in employment. And it would be great if we could do it. But I think the reality is, whether you're an athlete or employee, you're dealing with those uncontrollables a lot. And a lot of times it's going to have more impact. And as long as we recognize it's not going to start to peel back our belief and how we can be competent and autonomous, then we're getting into using our strengths intelligently. So what do we do? So I apologize. I don't know everyone's role or where you guys are in Groupon. So some of this might seem a little bit more if you've got direct reports. We'll try to make it as general, and please feel free to ask how you could specifically do it in your role. So things that we want to do. Okay, some of these are pretty does. But yeah, this is sort of summarizing it. So we want to try to build people's intrinsic motivation. So thinking about it, though, more specifically in terms of competency, autonomy, and relatedness, recognizing that it's important to pair competency and autonomy together, okay? It seems like Groupon's culture really does thrive on the relatedness component of it, and it does sound like from some of the examples that it actually does a pretty good job of encouraging the other two as well. So create security for exploration. So research shows that people at the top and people who are at entry levels have the least resistance to risk. Why? Because if you're at the top, chances are if you mess up, nothing bad's going to happen to you. If you're at the ground level, well, there's not much impact it's truly going to have yet. But it's the middle managements, people who are probably doing the most in terms of access and creating impact, that end up conforming. One, because sometimes it's rewarded, and two, because there's risk aversion to, if I mess up, what happens to me. So understanding in your role, where can you either build that security for yourself, whether it's with trusted resources and knowledge bases, or how can you create it for your team, whether you're having a private team meeting or whether you're looking to present something to a wider network. Integrate your values. And I'm going to see, integrate values, optimal challenges, and multiple roles. So you guys nailed multiple roles here. Integrating the values is sort of an interesting one. And part of that just speaks to why you're here in the first place, right? Groupon is a very distinct culture, and that culture is something that, because of its size and because of it's still, it's gone through its own evolution process, it's had a chance to really understand and promote the culture consistently. Now, does that mean in every division across the board it's being lived? Probably not. So it's understanding how, whether it's happening in your division or not, how you can actually take the people around you and find ways to integrate your values. So I'm going to go back to our activity for a second and say, how do you guys make describing things differently, having different character traits, how do you integrate those things? How do you find ways to connect them even though they may seemingly disconnect? Okay, so that brings us to the right side, the how. So these sort of, again, I apologize. I mean, they sort of seem very much like high level. And part of that is just I'm not immersed to really understand what the more direct and descriptive ways would be appropriate. But when you are thinking about either asking for a reward or giving a reward, if you understand what's important to someone, if you understand what's important to yourself, and even understand how that would impact your motivation and your desire to grow and learn, think about ways you can ask for something different. What else might you think would be a way to encourage yourself and stay on that side of the spectrum? Growth mindset's pretty popular. It's been around for a while, but it's a really, really great way. There's a wonderful matrix out there that talks about the 5 different elements and how do you really take a look at which element you can bring into your workspace. And it doesn't have to be all of them, but it's just those little fractions that, again, lead to greater self-actualization. So people feel like they're being rewarded for things that matter to them as well. And then, so the last bullet point, gradual increases, model activity, positive reinforcement, encouraging environment, is actually taken from the sports world, mostly when it comes to collegiate athletes, because of the transition they're making, and they're still at a place where they're learning and they're not necessarily at the highest level of their game. And that's the idea of, don't be afraid to be incremental, don't be afraid to still reward and do things on increments versus just waiting for the big outcome. Those gradual, short, meaningful wins are important, and they'll be important to you if you give them to yourselves. How does that happen? Sometimes it's just modeling the activity. And I think it's so great that you guys have exposure to so many different divisions and places where you can grow and meet new people. So it's not about finding necessarily the role model. It's sometimes you being the role model back and showing how we're going to model be executing on something. On a sales team, for example, like what's the best way to be the salesperson is sometimes it takes modeling it, right? We emulate, we learn by watching someone else do a kick-ass job. Positive reinforcement is, very, very broad. But if you really take everything on this page and connect it back to the specific things we're talking about, and using positive reinforcement as it relates to CAR, using positive reinforcement as it relates to the different dimensions of motivation. Don't worry about it being this huge umbrella that seems very ambiguous and generalized. Now you have very specific ways to identify what that really could look like and mean. Anyone have any questions or thoughts? No? Okay. Well, we're wrapping it up. The last thing are the results, right? And a lot of this is just cute graphics that have some nice words on peak performance and your personal empowerment skills and professional skills. But it's another way to demonstrate when you're self-actualizing yourself, you're going to self-actualize that into the output of the business strategy. You're going to self-actualize that into being the best teammate, the best leader, and find new ways to be successful other than sort of following the path that's already carved out. And building like who you are, I think in today's world is like building your brand. Like that, this is like maybe a more granular level of talking about how do you brand yourself, right? These are my core values, here's what motivates me, and this is who I am, and this is who I want to be. And so that's sort of how you could intelligently bring it into the workplace where the results are not only empowering for you, but it's empowering for the people around you and creates an employability factor that everyone can sort of resonate off of. Any questions? Any thoughts, comments? Anyone sort of think that there's something that they want answered more specifically? Because I'm done. Anyone on Zoom have any questions or comments?
I just have one question with Be Sports Minded in general.
Okay.
As a part of this whole program, I did end up taking the positive psychology program from UPenn itself, from Dr. Martin Seligman and Karen Zaevich, and I think they ended up working with the Oklahoma Thunders as well sometime in 2010-11, which they spoke about. How much of your work is kind of an offshoot or different, and how did you apply machine learning to this entire process overall?
Okay, it was hard for me to hear. I heard a bit about, you were referencing the positive psychology and their work. I heard 2010. Was there's something specific?
Yes, I think they worked with, can you guys hear me now?
Okay.
Can you hear me now or no?
Yes, the turn is up.
Try saying it one more time. There's something about my work being an offshoot of what they're doing. Yeah, right?
Yeah, I think they did some work with the Oklahoma Thunders like about a decade ago, as a part of NBA. How much of your work is kind of an offshoot by applying machine learning to what they were doing, or how is it kind of different from some of the work which has been done before?
Sure. So I'm going to repeat it back and let me know if I understand it correctly. How much does the machine learning platform that I have differ from some of the work that they've done?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm friendly with, Adam Grant and the Wharton People Analytics program. Martin Seligman and the positive psychology I'm just more a student than working with the people there. Now, Angela Duckworth is part of their People Analytics program. They have a consortium with some of the sports teams. But at the end of the day, what I've done is really just bridge some of the work so when I was hired by the Mets, I was just traveling with the team. And I was in the straight, sports psych role. It was more as they started to look for competitive edges that I said I wanted to explore the analytics of the person. So there could be some crossover and similarity. I wouldn't doubt that. But really mine sort of emanated from me putting it together for the Mets and then saying I want to go off and try to do this on a more grand level, and then finding someone here in Chicago who is using the machine learning for corporate succession planning and being able to partner with them so we could modify it so it would be appropriate for the sports world. And so I imagine that there are some similarities. The theories are the theories that are out there that have stuck, so it's not, sometimes there's like multiple ways that people are describing something or looking at something. This is what it is. Like, if this is the stuff that's been verified, it's validated, it's trustworthy.
Yeah, I think it's great because there are very few people who use machine learning in this world, and also there's an appetite for this kind of research work that you're doing as well. So I think it was very interesting to see how you've tied in some of these concepts to apply machine learning itself, and
No, I appreciate hearing that.
and stuff. So,
Yeah, it's taking out the bias, right? Because recruiters, like when you guys all interviewed, right, someone's there talking to you and you're like, what do they know about me? So this is like sort of allowing them to do their jobs better without having to necessarily evaluate you. So as a person with their biases. All right, I think everyone's, yeah, all right. Thank you for your time, everybody. Thank you.